Alara Weston had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. The year was 1878, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing, a companion that had seeped into the log walls of the small cabin her husband had built with his own hands. For 2 long years, that heavy, constant presence had sat with her at the rough-hewn table, occupying the space where Arthur's laughter used to be. Sometimes, when the evening light fell, just so, she could still see him there, his large hands calloused from the labor of a dozen trades, carefully sanding the rough wood as he talked of a future. He spoke of a family, of a schoolhouse, of children with her smile running through the tall prairie grass. It was a beautiful memory, a cruel one, because those dreams had been buried beneath the same raw earth that now held him. Grief, she had learned, was not a fleeting storm, but a permanent season, a long winter of the soul that had frozen her heart solid. Her days were a stark and unchanging routine, a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull her under. She rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and soft roses. Her movements economical and practiced. Every task was a silent prayer, a plea for the day to pass without incident, without thought. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with the earth, a testament to her constant, weary battle with the land. The simple act of pulling a weed was a monumental effort of will, a fight against a weariness that went bone deep. She tended to her 2 chickens, their clucking a brief and welcome disruption, and nursed the stubborn rows of beans and potatoes in her small, fenced-in garden, their tenacity, their silent struggle against the arid soil, was a reproach to her own weary resignation. The cabin stood alone, a tiny defiant speck in a vast, indifferent landscape. The prairie rolled out in every direction, a sea of grass that rippled and swayed with the ceaseless wind. The wind itself was another constant, a mournful voice that howled around the eaves at night like a thing grieving with her. It carried the scent of dust, sagebrush, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at the sky, their stony faces impassive and ancient. It was a beautiful land, a brutal land, and it had taken everything from her. Arthur had seen promise here. He had seen a future. Now all Elara saw was the simple wooden cross she had carved herself. Standing on a low hill overlooking the creek, a marker for a grave and a tombstone for a dream. She had lived in this state of suspended animation, the numbness having become her only shield. She did not venture into the dusty, silver-mining town of Havenwood unless necessity demanded it. And even then, she kept her visits as short as a breath held underwater. The pity in the eyes of the townsfolk was a thing she could not bear, a mirror reflecting a brokenness she preferred to ignore. She remembered the last time she went to town, trading her eggs for flour and salt. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the hushed whispers that followed her down the muddy main street like a swarm of flies. Poor thing, all alone out there. Wonder she hasn't lost her mind. They saw a widow, a victim, a fragile porcelain doll waiting to break. They did not see the core of iron that kept her standing, the sheer stubborn will to simply endure. Their judgment, their sad-eyed sympathy, had become a wall, separating her from a world that had nothing left to offer her but a reflection of her own sorrow. One afternoon, the oppressive stillness of mid-August was shattered. The air, thick with heat and the smell of dust, was suddenly pierced by the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle shot. Elara, who had been on her knees pulling weeds from around her potato plants, froze. Her hands, thick with soil, paused their work as a strange, hot gust of wind carried with it the faint scent of fear and smoke. A scent so out of place it felt like a premonition. Her head snapped up, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, and a second shot echoed closer this time. It was followed by the rough, cruel shouts of men, their curses snatched and torn apart by the wind, the unmistakable sound of a hunt. She scrambled to her feet, wiping dirt from her worn dress with a trembling hand, and peered over the top of her split-rail fence. 2 riders were thundering across the prairie, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the still air. They were men in the filthy, trail-worn clothes of drifters or bounty hunters, and they were chasing something or someone. Then she saw him, a boy no older than 10, running with the desperate, stumbling gait of pure terror. He was Lakota, his dark hair flying behind him, his small body straining with the effort. He glanced back, and in that fleeting moment, Elara saw the whites of his eyes, wide with a fear so profound it stole her breath. He was just a child. The men were closing the distance, their laughter carrying on the wind, not a sound of pursuit, but of a cruel sport. The boy's strength was failing. He tripped, his small form pitching forward into the tall grass not 50 yards from her fence line. A wounded animal trying to disappear into the earth. Dakota. The world had become a blur of terror and burning lungs. The names of his ancestors were a silent prayer on his lips, a plea for the speed of a bison, the cunning of a coyote. He had been gathering firewood when the 2 men appeared, their rifles glinting in the sun like a promise of death. He ran, not toward his camp, but toward the one place they would least expect him to go, the desolate homestead of the White Widow. He had seen her from a distance, a silent, solitary figure tending her land, and a desperate, half-formed thought had taken root in his mind that perhaps her loneliness was a shield he could hide behind. But his legs were failing him. The sharp grass blades whipped at his face. The thudding of hooves behind him was the relentless beat of a drum, a death chant, as he fell. He closed his eyes, a final surrender, expecting to feel the rough hands of his captors. Then he heard a new voice, a woman's voice, a roar against the wind. He peeked through the grass, seeing her standing there, a strange, defiant silhouette against the pale sky. He was confused. This was a white woman, one of the people his grandfather warned him about, but her courage was something he had never seen before. A small, dangerous spark of hope ignited within him. Something inside Elara, something long dormant and frozen over, cracked. It was not a thought, it was an instinct, primal and fierce. The image of the boy's terrified face superimposed itself over a fading memory of another child, one she had dreamed of but never held. The stasis that had governed her life for 2 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. She moved without conscious decision, her body propelled by a force she did not recognize as her own. She unlatched the garden gate and ran, her worn boots sinking into the dry soil. "Leave him be," she shouted, her voice a roar from disuse. It was thinner than she had intended, a reed against the vastness of the plains. But it carried. The 2 men, Silas and Jed, reined in their horses. Surprised by her sudden appearance, they were hard-faced and unshaven, their eyes small and mean. The taller one, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Well, now, Jed," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. "Look what we got here. A little prairie hen getting all ruffled." Jed, a heavier man with a bloated red face, chuckled. "Mind your own business. Lady, we got dealings with this here thing?" "Well, he's on my land," Elara said, positioning herself between them and the spot where the boy was hiding in the grass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steadier now. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot surge of protective fury. "And I'm telling you to leave him alone, the scarred man." Silas dismounted slowly. His movements were lazy, arrogant, as if she were little more than an inconvenience. The spurs on his boots jingled a menacing, tinny song as he walked toward her. Your land. This is God's country, woman. And that thing in the grass ain't human enough to deserve a claim to any of it. He's the son of that murdering chief. Wakan might be worth something. Might be. He took another step, a grimy hand reaching out to shove her aside. But Elara stood her ground, her gaze unblinking. She could feel the boy's fear radiating from the grass behind her, a palpable wave of desperation. She was all he had. I'm telling you to step aside. Woman, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. This ain't your fight, and it damn sure ain't worth dying over. This here is a matter of law, of justice. That boy's people have been stealing our land, murdering our people. He's got to be taught a lesson. And so does his chief. And if you're going to get in the way, then you're no better than they are. He reached for her again, this time with more purpose. His hand a shadow of his foul intent. But before he could touch her, Jed, still on his horse, let out a sharp, impatient shout. He drew a long-barreled Colt revolver, the polished steel glinting in the sun, and aimed it squarely at Elara's chest. Silas, stop fooling around. Jed's voice was a gravelly scrape. Just get the kid and let's go. I ain't got all day to be standing around with some lunatic woman. The click of the hammer being cocked was a sharp, final sound that cut through the silence of the prairie. The world seemed to stop, the wind holding its breath. Elara's gaze flickered from Jed's gun to Silas's narrowed eyes, then to the grass where Coda lay hidden. The fear in her stomach turned to ice, but the protective fire in her heart burned even hotter. She saw the malice in their faces, the cold, unfeeling cruelty that had no place for pity or reason. This was not about justice or law, it was about power, about a twisted sense of entitlement and hatred. The world had taken Arthur from her, and in that moment, she vowed it would not take this child as well. Her grief, her years of silent suffering, had led her to this moment. She was no longer a victim. She was a shield. She took a slow, deliberate breath, standing her ground with an unwavering resolve that was a stark contrast to the trembling of her hands. The gun was aimed at her heart, and she knew it was a choice she had to make. The sharp, metallic click of the Colt's hammer being cocked was the last distinct sound Elara heard before the world dissolved into a blinding white flash and a deafening roar. It was not a single sound, but two. A brutal 1-2 punch that slammed into her body with the force of a battering ram. The first hit her shoulder, a searing fire that exploded outward, splintering bone and tearing flesh. The second struck her side, a duller, more profound impact that stole her breath and sent a shockwave of agony through her core. Her body, no longer a vessel of will but a puppet of violence, crumpled. The sky, a perfect, pale blue a moment before, spun into a violent spiral of colors, and the tall grass rushed up to meet her with an indifferent rustle. She felt the impact of the earth, the soft, forgiving give of the soil. And then, mercifully, nothing at all. The world she had known, a world of silent grief and solitary defiance, went black, a long, undefined time later. A flickering awareness began to return to her. It was not a sudden waking, but a slow, painful crawl back from the abyss. The first thing she noticed was not a sound or a sight, but a smell, a complex, earthy aroma of dried sage, sweetgrass, and some other pungent herb she couldn't name. It was clean and healing, a stark contrast to the dust and gunpowder that had filled her last conscious moments. Then came the warmth, a gentle, all-encompassing heat that radiated from beneath her and wrapped her like a mother's embrace. She was lying on something soft, a bed of furs and hides, and a heavy blanket was pulled up to her chin. The pain, while a constant, throbbing presence in her shoulder and side, had dulled to a bearable ache. She forced her eyes to flutter open, the lids feeling heavy and swollen. Above her was not the rough-hewn ceiling of her cabin, but a latticework of wooden poles and buffalo hide. A conical ceiling that disappeared into a ring of smoke and light. A small fire crackled softly in the center of the structure, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the space with a comforting, hypnotic glow. A woman was kneeling by the fire, her back to Elara. She was older, with a face lined by sun and time, and her long gray hair was braided with strips of red leather. Her hands, nimble and sure, moved over a small stone bowl, crushing herbs with a pestle. Elara lay still, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of her surroundings. This was not the home of Silas and Jed. This was not the town doctor's office. This was a teepee, a wave of cold fear, sharper than the pain in her wounds, washed over her. She had been shot. She should be dead. Or worse, she should be a captive, a trophy for the men who had shot her. But the gentle touch of the blanket, the careful, measured movements of the woman by the fire, spoke of something else entirely. It spoke of care, of healing, of a kindness she couldn't reconcile with the stories she had grown up with. Havenwood had painted the Lakota people as savage marauders, a relentless tide of violence threatening their way of life. But here, in the heart of what she had been taught to fear, she was being tended to, treated with a reverence that felt like a sacrilege against all her long-held beliefs. The woman turned, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes were deep and wise, a well of quiet observation. She had been born in this land, and it showed in the steady certainty of her gaze. She was Miko, the tribe's medicine woman, though Elara did not know it then. Miko's face held no judgment, only a deep, ancient wisdom. She rose and moved to Elara's side, her movements as fluid and silent as the wind. Elara flinched instinctively, her body tensing, but Miko's touch was impossibly gentle. She lifted the blanket, revealing the tight, neat bandages wrapped around Elara's shoulder and abdomen. There was no sign of crude stitching or neglect. The wounds had been cleaned and carefully dressed with some kind of poultice that smelled of earth and mountain roots. Miko's hands moved over the bindings, a soft hum leaving her lips, a sound that was both a prayer and a lullaby. Elara's bewilderment was a tangible thing, a fog that obscured her thoughts. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a raspy whisper. Why? She managed, the word a small, broken thing. Miko seemed to understand the question in her eyes, even if the word was foreign. With a slow, reassuring gesture, she dipped a small wooden cup into a container of water and held it to Elara's lips. The cool liquid was a blessing, and Elara drank greedily, the long-forgotten sensation of thirst reminding her that she was, against all odds, still alive. Miko then said something in her native tongue, her voice soft and melodic, her hand gesturing to the entrance of the teepee. The message was clear. There was no threat here. The sound of footsteps outside drew her attention, and the flap of the teepee was pushed aside. A small figure ducked inside, holding something in his hands. It was Koda, the boy from the prairie. He was no longer running, no longer desperate. He was solemn, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that held both gratitude and a quiet sorrow. He walked to the fire, knelt, and placed a small, carved wooden buffalo figurine on the earth near her bed. A silent offering of thanks. He did not speak, but his eyes said it all. He had seen her fall. He had been the one to find her, to run back and get help, to bring her here. He had saved her life, just as she had tried to save his. The cycle of fear and prejudice she had lived by for so long began to crack and splinter, the ice of her grief giving way to a new, unsettling warmth. A moment later, another figure entered. He was a man of immense presence, his shoulders broad and his face etched with the wisdom of many years. His gaze was deep and penetrating, and he stood with a quiet authority that required no words. This was Wakan, the chief of the Lakota people. He looked from her to the bandages, and then to Koda, a small, almost imperceptible nod passing between them. He knelt, his presence filling the teepee with a sense of quiet power. He spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with the deep history of the land. Miko, still at Elara's side, translated his words with a soft, careful cadence. "He asks you," she said, her voice a bridge between two worlds. "Why you did it. Why did you stand against the guns of your own kind? Why did you protect his son, a stranger to you?" The question hung in the air, a profound and simple demand for truth. Elara felt a rush of blood to her head, a sudden clarity that pierced through the fog of pain and confusion. She thought of Arthur, of the long, silent nights in her cabin, of the heavy, suffocating loneliness that had become her constant companion. She thought of Koda, of the terror she had seen in his eyes, a terror so absolute it had mirrored her own. She looked at Wakan, at Miko, at Koda's small, hopeful face, and the truth, raw and unadorned, spilled from her lips. I do not know you," she said, her voice still weak but firm with conviction. "And I did not know your son, but I saw his fear. He was running, alone, and no one." Her voice broke slightly. No one should have to be afraid alone. The words were not just for them. They were for herself, a confession of her own isolation, a testament to the shared human experience of fear and vulnerability. A profound silence filled the teepee. Wakan's expression, which had been unreadable before, softened. He looked at Miko, at Koda, and then back at Elara. His eyes filled with an understanding that transcended language. He did not need to be told of her grief or her loneliness. He saw it in the hollows of her eyes, in the fierce, protective fire that had burned through her pain. Her answer, so simple and so pure, had not been an act of political defiance or a grand gesture of heroism. It had been an act of empathy, a recognition of a shared pain that was far deeper than any cultural divide. He reached out a hand, a gesture of respect and acceptance, and placed it on the small wooden buffalo Koda had left by her side. A silent promise was made in that moment. The shield she had become was no longer her solitary burden. It was now a part of something larger. The silence that followed Wakan's words was not empty, but full. It was a silence filled with the weight of his understanding, the quiet gratitude of a son saved, and the deep, abiding presence of a people who had recognized a kindred spirit in the heart of a grieving white woman. The hand he had placed on the small wooden buffalo was not a threat but a promise, a gesture of profound trust and acceptance. In that moment, Elara felt the brittle shell of her old life, the life of a silent widow defined by absence and loneliness, begin to crack and fall away. She was not Arthur's wife, not a victim of the prairie. She was something new, something forged in fire, and a simple, honest act of defiance. Over the next weeks, Elara's world expanded from the confines of her cabin walls to the sprawling, vibrant circle of the Lakota encampment. She was no longer a patient in a strange land, but a guest of honor, a woman whose name was spoken with hushed reverence. Miko, with her deep, knowing eyes, tended to her wounds with an ancient wisdom that seemed to draw strength from the very earth itself. Under her care, Elara's body began to heal, the pain in her shoulder and side receding from a constant roar to a manageable echo. But it was not just her body that was mending. Miko taught her the names of the herbs she used, the cleansing power of sage, the soothing properties of a certain root she harvested from the riverbank. She taught her to listen to the land, not as a conqueror, but as a silent partner, a co-conspirator in the grand, cyclical dance of life and death. Coda, the boy she had protected, became her shadow. He would bring her food, small gifts of carved wood or river stones, and sit silently by her side. His presence a constant, comforting weight. He had a quiet, serious joy, and in his eyes, Elara saw not a child of a different world, but the son she had dreamed of, a son who had now, improbably, found his way to her. She would try to teach him small things in English, pointing to the sky, the sun, the mountains, and he would respond with a shy smile and the Lakota word for each. A gentle exchange that built a bridge between their two languages and two worlds. In the evening, she would sit by the fire with the others, listening to the soft murmur of their voices, the rhythmic beat of a drum, and the haunting, melodic songs that seemed to carry the history of their people on the wind. She felt a joy that was both new and profoundly familiar, a sense of belonging that warmed the frozen corners of her heart and thawed the grief she had carried for so long. The day of the ceremony arrived with the rising sun, a day of clear skies and a gentle breeze that rustled the teepee flaps. Elara, dressed in a soft deerskin tunic given to her by Miko, was led to the center of the encampment, where a large fire burned, its smoke rising straight and true into the heavens. The entire tribe had gathered, their faces painted with ochre and clay, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Wakan stood before the fire, his presence more immense than ever, his voice a deep, resonant chord that spoke to the very soul of the land. He spoke of the day of the chase, of the guns of the white men, and of the woman who had stood between a child and death. He spoke of her courage, not as an act of recklessness, but as an act of a mother's heart, a defender's spirit. Then, with a solemn gesture, he held a feather high in the air, its tip painted crimson. "You stood as a shield against our enemies," he proclaimed, his voice echoing across the encampment. "You put your body between a father's son and the guns of injustice. You are no longer known as the lonely widow of the plains. You are Elara, but your spirit is new, and your name must reflect that spirit. We name you Iktomi Wakan." Miko, standing at her side, whispered the translation. "Shield warrior, you are now a part of us, and we are a part of you." A cheer erupted from the crowd, a powerful, joyful sound that wrapped around Elara like a physical thing. She felt the tears well in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or grief, but tears of a profound, heart-shattering gratitude. For 2 years, she had been defined by what she had lost. Today, she was defined by what she had found: a family, a purpose, a name. The return to her cabin was inevitable. The tribe was grateful. But the winds of winter were beginning to stir, and with them came the deep-seated worry of a people who had lost much and were now facing a season of scarcity. The buffalo herds had been driven further north by the relentless hunting of the white men, and the resources for winter were dwindling. The shadow of conflict with the nearby settlers, who were pushing ever westward, was a heavy cloak over the entire encampment. Wakan's protection of her and her land was a silent declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand that Elara knew would not go unnoticed. Back on her homestead, the silence was no longer a comfort, but an omen. The world she had left, the world of her grief, now felt strangely alien. The rough-hewn table, the empty chair, the silent walls, they were no longer a sanctuary, but a reminder of the life she had once had, and the new life that now waited for her with its own challenges. She tended her garden, her hands moving with a newfound certainty, her mind still filled with the faces and voices of the Lakota people. She was not alone. The knowledge of their presence, their promise, was a constant, comforting warmth in her heart, but that comfort was not shared by the outside world. The news of the prairie hen who had been shot and saved by the savages traveled faster than the wind, arriving in Havenwood not as a tale of heroism, but of betrayal. When she went to town to trade her goods, the stares were different now. They were not filled with pity, but with a cold, simmering hostility. The townsfolk, who had seen her as a victim, now saw her as a traitor. They whispered about the squaw lover, about her being unclean, the blacksmith, a man who had been kind to Arthur, now averted his eyes, and the general store owner, a woman who had once offered her a slice of pie, now gave her a short, cold look as she counted out the coins for her flour. The isolation she had chosen was now being forced upon her. But this time, it was laced with the venom of hatred and prejudice. The name Iktomi Wakan, her proud new identity, was a target painted on her back. The fear became a palpable thing when she returned to her cabin one morning after a long, restless night. She had been staying in the encampment, but she had felt a strange pull back to the homestead, an instinct that something was not right. The moment she saw her fence, she knew one of the old rails, a rail that Arthur had carved himself, had been splintered, not by an animal, but by the deliberate swing of an axe. The gate to her chicken coop was ajar, the lock broken, and one of her prized hens was missing. Her small garden, which had been her last solace, had been trampled, the young sprouts crushed into the dry earth. It was a small act of violence, a petty act of hatred. But the message was clear. It was not a robbery, but it was a warning. Elara stood in the middle of her broken garden, her heart hammering against her ribs. But it was not the heart of a frightened widow. It was the heart of a warrior. The name Wakan had given her was not just an honor. It was a burden, a heavy mantle of responsibility and danger. Her act of kindness had not only saved a child, but had drawn a line in the dirt, a line that the world of Havenwood would not tolerate. She had found a new family, a new purpose, but she now understood that to be a shield for others. She would first have to learn to be a warrior herself. The true test of her new name had only just begun. The splintered fence post was not just a piece of broken wood, it was a line drawn in the sand, a declaration of war. It was the moment Elara realized that the world of Havenwood, the world of her past, would not stand idly by and watch her choose a new path. The petty acts of hatred, the missing hen, the trampled garden were not the work of thieves, but of a poison that had begun to seep into the community she once called her own. It was a poison born of fear and resentment, and it had found a target in her newfound identity. She was no longer just the grieving widow. She was now the Iktomi Wakan, the shield warrior, and her name carried a weight of responsibility she was just beginning to understand. For the next few weeks, Elara divided her time between her cabin and the Lakota encampment. She spent her days mending the broken fence, tending to her small, ravaged garden, and keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The peace she had found with the Lakota was a fragile thing, constantly under threat from the world outside. She would return to the encampment in the evenings, finding solace in the rhythmic beat of the drums and the quiet strength of her new family. She learned to track, to read the signs on the wind, to understand the subtle language of the land in a way she never had before. Coda, now more confident and full of a youthful energy, would teach her the names of the constellations. Pointing to the night sky and whispering the Lakota words for the stars that had guided his ancestors for centuries, she felt a profound sense of purpose, a feeling that had been lost since Arthur's death. But it was a fragile purpose, one that hung by a thread, and she knew in her bones that the final test was yet to come. The day it all came to a head was as clear and bright as any other. The sun beat down on the parched earth, and a lazy wind stirred the dust into soft eddies. Elara, who was at her cabin, felt a strange, cold prickle on the back of her neck, an instinct she had learned from the Lakota. She climbed the small knoll behind her cabin, where Arthur's grave lay, and looked out over the endless expanse of the prairie. In the distance, she saw them. It was not just two riders this time, but a small caravan of men, maybe a dozen, their faces grim and their purpose clear. They were a mix of the usual drifters and miners from Havenwood, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the air like a storm cloud. She recognized the lean, scarred form of Silas at the head of the group, and the hulking figure of Jed beside him. They were coming for her, for Coda, and for the land. Elara didn't hesitate. She ran back to her cabin, grabbed her husband's old rifle from its hook, and began to run toward the Lakota encampment. She knew the men would have to cross her land to get there, and she knew this was her chance to buy her new family some time. As she ran, her mind raced. The men from Havenwood would be armed, dangerous, and driven by a greed that knew no bounds. She couldn't fight them with brute force, but she could fight them with something they didn't have knowledge. She knew their laws, their language, and their weaknesses. She was a bridge between two worlds. And now, for the first time, she had to use that unique position to defend the one that had taken her in. She reached a low bluff that overlooked the main trail, a place where the men would have to pass to get to the encampment. She found a hiding spot, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and waited. The men drew closer, their voices a low, angry hum. Elara could hear them talking, their words thick with a self-righteous anger. "That widow's gone and sided with the heathens," she heard Silas say, his voice a gravelly snarl. "We got a right to this land. The government says so. These savages ain't got no claim to it." Jed, his face a bloated mask of fury, pointed to Elara's cabin. "We'll burn her place to the ground, make an example of her. She'll learn her place." Elara's anger, a white-hot and righteous flame, burned away all her fear. She was not a victim, not a pawn in their game. She was the shield warrior, and she would stand her ground. She emerged from her hiding place, her husband's rifle held loosely in her hands. The men stopped, their horses whinnying nervously. They were surprised to see her, alone and defiant, standing in their path. Silas, his face a mask of disbelief, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Well now, if it ain't the little squaw lover herself. You came to say your goodbyes." Elara met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She spoke not to him, but to the others, her voice ringing out with a clear, steady authority that silenced their curses. "This is not your land to claim," she said, her voice echoing on the open plains. "It is the Lakota's, by the laws of this territory. No one has the right to take it without a treaty." She pointed to a small, handwritten deed in her pocket, a document for her homestead that she had not looked at in 2 years. "I have a deed to this land, a deed that was signed by a government agent. The law is on my side, not yours." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The law? What law you think some piece of paper is going to stop us?" But the men behind him were starting to look uncertain. The word deed had a powerful hold on them, a sacred truth in the world of the white man. Elara saw her chance. "I've sent a messenger to Havenwood," she lied, her voice steady. "They're on their way to alert the sheriff. By the time you get to the encampment, they'll be on your trail. I am a witness to your illegal actions, and I will testify against you. And if you dare to cross this line," she said, her eyes fixed on Silas, "if you dare to touch one hair on Coda's head, you will not be facing a widow. You will be facing me. The Lakota people have named me Iktomi Wakan. I am their shield warrior. And if you want war, you will have to go through me first." Her words were not just a bluff, they were a promise. The men hesitated, their bravado giving way to a new, cold fear. They had come for a quick and easy victory, not a long, drawn-out legal battle, and certainly not a confrontation with a woman who had a claim to the land and the courage of a warrior. The men, now looking at each other nervously, began to pull back, their lust for land and violence checked by a legal threat they had not anticipated. Silas and Jed, furious but outmaneuvered, stared at her with pure, undiluted hatred before turning their horses and riding away. Their mission a failure. The victory, though hard won, was fleeting. Elara watched them go, their forms shrinking into specks on the horizon, and a profound sense of exhaustion washed over her. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance now drained away, leaving her body trembling and her mind reeling. She returned to the Lakota encampment, the men's furious words still ringing in her ears, to find Wakan standing by the central fire, his face grim and his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. He had seen the men, had watched the confrontation from a distance, and he knew that this was only the beginning. He did not praise her for her bravery, but instead, he issued a warning, his voice a low, somber rumble that spoke to the very soul of the land. "You have faced them and won. Iktomi Wakan," he said. The name a heavy mantle she was just beginning to wear. "But they are not like us. They do not honor a promise made in the open air, nor do they fear the spirits of the land. They fear only their own laws and their own greed. They will not forget this day. They will return, and they will be angrier. And next time," he said, his gaze fixed on her with a frightening intensity, "they will not be so easily turned away by a piece of paper." His words struck a cold chord in Elara's heart. She had used the one weapon she had, her knowledge of their laws, and it had worked. But Wakan's warning was a stark reminder of the fundamental difference between their two worlds. The white man's law was a fickle, man-made thing, easily bent and broken. The Lakota's law was the law of the earth, of the ancestors, of a connection to the land that ran deeper than any piece of paper. The victory, she realized, was a fragile illusion. She had not won a war, she had merely postponed it. As the days shortened and the wind began to carry the first chill of autumn, the grim reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. The buffalo herds, their lifeblood, had been driven so far north that the hunters returned with empty hands and heavy hearts. The stores for winter were critically low, and the tribe, a once proud and self-sufficient people, now faced the very real threat of starvation, the conflict with the white settlers. Now emboldened by their failed attempt to claim the land, was no longer a distant threat but a constant, gnawing anxiety. Elara, now fully a part of the tribe, took on a new role. With her knowledge of the white man's ways, she was able to navigate the treacherous world of the settlers. She would ride into Havenwood, her face a mask of careful neutrality, and trade what little the tribe had for supplies. She would return to her cabin, her heart heavy with the weight of their desperate situation, and share what she had with her new family. But she knew that this was a temporary solution. The men from Havenwood, especially Silas and Jed, were watching her every move, their hatred a palpable thing that followed her like a shadow. She was a bridge between two worlds, but that bridge was now a target, and the two worlds were on a collision course. She knew she had to act. She had to use her position, her unique knowledge, to find a permanent solution, a way to save her people from the coming winter and the relentless march of the white man. She could not fight them with guns and arrows. She had to fight them with a different kind of weapon, a weapon of wit, of knowledge, of a courage that was born not of violence, but of love. The fate of the Lakota, the future of Koda, and her own destiny were all intertwined. The shield warrior was ready for her greatest challenge yet. The wind that swept across the prairie in the aftermath of the confrontation was no longer a harsh, unforgiving force, but a gentle sigh of relief. The dust kicked up by Silas and his men settled back into the earth, and the silence that followed their retreat was not the oppressive silence of an empty world, but the quiet, comforting calm of a storm that had passed. Elara, standing alone on the bluff, watched them go until they were nothing more than a memory on the horizon. The rifle, heavy and familiar in her hands, felt different now. It was no longer a relic of a life lost, but a symbol of a life fought for. The trembling in her body was not fear, but the last shiver of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. One that had, against all odds, held its ground. The sun, setting on the horizon, painted the sky in a blaze of crimson and gold, and for the first time in 2 years, Elara saw not a beautiful end, but a breathtaking beginning. It was a sunset that promised not a cold, lonely night, but the quiet, comforting warmth of a home she had defended with her own strength. The walk back to the cabin was a slow one, her legs feeling like lead, but her heart feeling as light as a feather. The path, once a trail of her grief, now felt like a road to a new beginning. She saw the trampled garden, the broken fence, and the empty chicken coop not with the despair of a victim, but with the quiet resolve of a survivor. These were not scars of a defeat, but badges of a battle won. She would mend the fence. She would replant the garden, and she would rebuild her life. Not in the shadow of Arthur's memory, but in the fierce, life-affirming light of her new purpose. The grief for her husband, a constant, heavy weight on her heart for 2 long years, did not vanish. It simply changed its form. It was no longer a suffocating blanket, but a small, familiar warmth. A cherished part of her past that no longer dictated her future. She would touch the old wooden table he had made, not with a pang of sorrow, but with a quiet sense of gratitude for the life they had shared. A life that had, in its own way, led her to this moment. Her return to the Lakota encampment was met not with cheers or celebration, but with a quiet, profound respect. Wakan, his face a landscape of etched lines and ancient wisdom, simply nodded at her, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that went beyond words. The message was clear: she had earned her name. She had not only protected Kota, but she had protected them all, not with violence, but with a courage born of a deeper strength. Kota, his eyes wide and full of a mixture of fear and awe, ran to her side and wrapped his small arms around her waist, his body a silent testament to the life she had saved. In that moment, Elara felt a bond more powerful than any blood tie. He was not just the boy she had saved, he was her son. And she was his mother. The two of them, a white woman and a Lakota boy, were a testament to a new kind of family. One not defined by blood, but by love, courage, and a shared future. Life on the prairie settled into a new rhythm. Elara's days were no longer spent in the solitary routine of a widow. She would wake with the sun, the soft light of dawn a promise of a new day. She would go to the Lakota encampment and spend her mornings with Kota. She would teach him English, the words a gentle bridge between their 2 languages. She would point to the sun and say, "Sun," and he would respond with a shy smile and the Lakota word, "we." She would teach him about the stars and the stories of the old world. And in return, he would teach her about the spirits of the land and the stories of the Lakota ancestors. A world as vast and complex as her own. Their relationship was a beautiful, quiet exchange. A dance between 2 different cultures, 2 different worlds, held together by a thread of love and acceptance. She was not a teacher, and he was not a student. They were 2 souls learning from and healing each other. The loneliness that had been her constant companion slowly, gently, began to fade away, replaced by the warmth of a new family and a new purpose. She was not just a part of the Lakota tribe, she was the Iktomi Wakan, the shield warrior, a woman who had found her strength not in a husband's love, but in a mother's heart. The change in Havenwood was slow, but it was undeniable. The news of the confrontation on the bluff, of a lone woman turning away a dozen armed men with nothing but her wits and a piece of paper, had spread like wildfire. The town, a place of small-minded gossip and deep-seated prejudice, was forced to confront a new reality. The stares Elara received when she went to town were no longer filled with pity or hostility. They were filled with a new emotion, respect. There was a quiet awe in the eyes of the townsfolk, a deep-seated fear of a woman who had faced down their own and won one afternoon. A farmer, a man who had once been among those who averted their eyes, approached her. He was a tall, stoop-shouldered man, his hands calloused from years of hard work. He stood awkwardly before her, twisting his hat in his hands. "My boy, he's got a fever," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The doc says there ain't nothing he can do, but I heard you know things. The way the Indians know things." Elara, her face a mask of careful neutrality, listened silently. She did not judge him for his past prejudice. She saw only a desperate father, a man who, in his moment of greatest need, had come to her not as a widow or a squaw lover, but as a woman of power, a woman of knowledge. She gave him a small bag of herbs, the same herbs Miko had used to heal her, and a few words of instruction. He thanked her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame, and walked away. The small act was a turning point. Others began to come to her, not with their gossip, but with their problems. A woman with a broken arm, a man with a stubborn sickness, a young boy with a deep, festering wound. Elara, with her knowledge of the white man's medicine and the ancient wisdom of the Lakota, became a bridge between two worlds, a healer who could speak both languages. She was no longer just the lonely widow, or the shield warrior, but a new kind of leader. A woman who had found her purpose not in a world of men, but in a world of her own making. A world that was a beautiful, living fusion of two different cultures, two different ways of life. She had found her peace, not in a world without struggle, but in a world where she had found her place, a world where she could truly be herself. The journey was not over, but the road ahead was no longer one of grief, but of purpose. And the future, once a cold and empty place, was now filled with the promise of a new dawn. Elara, now a woman with the quiet strength of the prairie etched into her every line, looked out over the vast expanse of her land. Years had passed since the day she had stood on the bluff, a lone figure facing down a storm of hatred and greed. The trampled garden had long since been replanted, and the broken fence had been meticulously mended, not with the hurried hands of a survivor, but with the patient, loving hands of someone building a home. The cabin, once a monument to her grief, was now a beacon of a new kind of life. Its walls, weathered by sun and wind, held not the echoes of a past love, but the vibrant energy of a present one. The old wooden table, once a symbol of her loneliness, was now the centerpiece of a bustling, multicultural family. A place where stories were told in two languages and laughter was a universal tongue. Coda, no longer the small, frightened boy who had sought refuge in her home, was now a tall, strong young man, his face a beautiful fusion of two worlds. He moved with the effortless grace of a Lakota hunter, but spoke with the careful, deliberate cadence of the English she had taught him. He was a son to her, a constant, living reminder of the courage she had found in the depths of her despair He would sit with her on the porch in the evenings, the sun setting on the horizon, and they would talk not of the past, but of the future. They would speak of the buffalo that were slowly, cautiously, returning to the land, of the new seeds they would plant in the spring, and of the new life that was beginning to blossom on the prairie. A life that was a beautiful, living testament to the two of them. The small act of a desperate farmer asking for her help had been the first domino in a slow, but profound change. The town of Havenwood, once a place of small-minded gossip and deep-seated prejudice, had begun to see Elara not as a strange, grieving widow, but as a woman of power, a woman of healing. Her cabin, once shunned, was now a destination. People would travel for miles, not just from Havenwood, but from other small towns scattered across the prairie, to seek her counsel. They would come with their ailments, with their broken bones and their festering wounds. And Elara, with her hands that knew both the white man's medicine and the Lakota's ancient herbal remedies, would heal them. She was no longer just the lonely widow or the shield warrior, but a new kind of leader, a bridge between two worlds. Her home, once a sanctuary from the world, had now become a sanctuary for the world. It was a place where white men and Lakota women could sit side by side, sharing stories and remedies, their differences melting away in the face of a shared humanity. Elara had fully embraced her role as the Iktomi Wakan. It was not the role of a fierce warrior, a fighter who stood on a bluff with a rifle in her hands. It was the role of a bridge, a healer, a woman who could see the humanity in both worlds and bring them together. The grief for Arthur had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a wound, but a quiet, constant presence, a reminder of the love that had led her to this moment. She would still visit his grave. The small wooden cross, a silent testament to the life they had shared, but she would visit it with a heart full of gratitude. Not sorrow. She would speak to him not of her loss, but of her victory, of the life she had built, of the son she had found, of the community she had created. The story was not just her own. It was the story of Coda, a boy who had found a mother in a world that had tried to take everything from him. It was the story of the Lakota tribe, a people who had found an unlikely ally and a true friend. It was the story of Havenwood, a town that had, in its own slow, clumsy way, learned to see beyond its own prejudices. And it was the story of the prairie itself, a vast, beautiful land that had witnessed a woman's journey from grief to purpose, from loneliness to belonging. The final scene, a memory that would be etched into the fabric of time, was the two of them, Elara and Coda, standing on the knoll behind the cabin, looking out at the endless, shimmering expanse of the prairie. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a blaze of crimson and gold, and the wind, a gentle, familiar presence, whispered 1,000 silent stories. She looked at Coda, her son, her family, and she saw in his eyes not the fear of the past, but the hope of the future. She looked at the cabin, her home, and she saw not a monument to her loss, but a living testament to her strength. She looked at the prairie, the land that had taken so much from her, and she saw not a cold, empty place, but a beautiful, vibrant world that had given her everything. She had found her home, not in a place, but in a purpose. She had found her family, not in blood, but in a love that was stronger than any barrier. A love that had mended a world and built a new dawn. She was no longer just a woman. She was a legend. And her story, the story of the Iktomi Wakan, would be whispered on the wind for generations to come.